Story 1. The Basement That Should Have Stayed Locked. Before we begin tonight's story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. It helps us bring you more spine-chilling tales every week. And let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Who knows? Someone else might be listening at the exact same moment as you, feeling that same cold shiver crawling down their spine. Tonight, we start with a story about a janitor, an ordinary man who discovered something extraordinary and horrifying beneath an old hospital, a discovery that was never meant to see the light of day. The basement that should have stayed locked. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, but what happens when the walls themselves remember pain, screams, and secrets so dark they should never have been unearthed? This is the story of Michael Turner, a night janitor who thought he was taking a simple cleanup job, until he learned why St. Agnes Memorial Hospital had been shut down decades earlier. Michael had been out of work for almost 8 months. Bills were piling up, his truck was on its last legs, and his landlord had already hinted at eviction. So, when he saw a last-minute posting for a night janitor at an old hospital scheduled for demolition, he didn't hesitate. The pay was better than minimum wage, and the hours were, well, lonely, but he could deal with that. On his first night, the supervisor, a grizzled old man named Frank, gave him a quick tour. St. Agnes was a maze of hallways and patient rooms, most of them stripped bare. The walls were yellowed with age, ceiling tiles sagging, and a faint smell of mildew and antiseptic lingered in the air. "You stick to the top 2 floors and the main lobby," Frank warned, his tone serious. "Don't bother with the basement. It's sealed off for a reason." Michael frowned. "What's down there?" Frank paused, then shook his head. "Just old storage and bad memories. The city'll be tearing it apart in a few months anyway. Stick to your route, clean what you're told, and you'll get paid. Simple as that." The way he said it didn't sit right with Michael, but he figured every old building had its ghosts, figuratively speaking. He wasn't superstitious. He was just a man with a mop, a paycheck, and a night ahead of him. For the first week, everything was normal, if not boring. Michael would put in his earbuds, listen to some old rock playlists, and scrub floors under the flickering fluorescent lights. But around the 7th night, he started to notice things. Odd things. When he passed the service elevator, he swore he could hear a low humming noise coming from below. Sometimes, faint scratching sounds like nails dragging on concrete. At first, he thought maybe rats had gotten into the old ventilation system, but when he mentioned it to Frank, the old man's face went pale. "Don't go near that elevator," Frank said sharply. "You hear me? If you value this job, hell, if you value your life, you leave it alone." Michael laughed it off, but unease was starting to creep in. Why such dramatic warnings over a basement? What was the big deal? 2 nights later, Michael was mopping near the eastern wing when he heard it, clear as day. A rhythmic, steady scratching echoing up through the service elevator shaft. It wasn't random like rats scurrying. It was patterned, almost deliberate. Scratch, 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 scratch. Michael froze, the mop dripping water onto the already stained linoleum. His heart thudded in his chest. He pulled one earbud out and listened harder. The sound grew louder, more urgent, like something was clawing at the walls far below. Suddenly, silence. Then, from deep below, a faint whisper rose through the shaft. "Help! Me!" Michael stumbled back, almost slipping. The voice was soft, strained, but undeniably human. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to run. But another part, stubborn curiosity, kept him rooted. He spent the rest of the shift jumpy and distracted, glancing over his shoulder at every sound. By the time dawn broke, he'd convinced himself he imagined it. Lack of sleep, maybe. Stress. Nothing more. That night, though, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He lay awake in his dingy apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying that whisper over and over. By the time his next shift rolled around, he'd made up his mind. He had to know what was down there. Frank wasn't around that night. Something about a city inspection. Michael took that as a sign. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a bolt cutter he borrowed from the supply closet, he approached the service elevator. The gate was chained shut with a rusted padlock. Michael's hands trembled as he snapped it open with the bolt cutter. The chain clattered to the floor, echoing unnaturally loud in the empty hallway. He pulled the gate aside and stepped into the elevator. The panel had only 2 buttons, G for ground floor and a worn, faded B. He hesitated for only a second before pressing B. The elevator groaned to life, descending with a low metallic rumble. As it sank lower and lower, Michael felt a strange pressure in his ears, like being deep underwater. The hum grew louder, a droning vibration that seemed to burrow into his skull. When the doors finally creaked open, a blast of cold, stale air hit him. He stepped out, sweeping his flashlight across the space. The basement was massive, lined with crumbling brick walls and rows of dusty shelves. Old gurneys and rusted medical equipment lay scattered like abandoned corpses. Everything smelled of mold, rust, and something metallic, something like blood. In the center of the room stood a single metal door, far newer than the rest of the basement. Thick bolts sealed it shut, and deep scratch marks marred the concrete around it. From the inside, Michael's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the source of the scratching. He approached slowly, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But when he leaned close, he heard it again. A faint, trembling voice, muffled but distinct. "Please, let me out. They locked me in here. Please." His heart twisted. Whoever was inside sounded terrified, desperate. Maybe it was some homeless person who'd gotten trapped. Maybe someone had fallen in and been stuck for days. Michael grabbed the heavy sliding latch and pulled. It didn't budge. He yanked harder, sweat dripping down his temples. "Hang on," he shouted. "I'm getting you out." The voice on the other side began sobbing, whispering incoherent thanks. Finally, with a shriek of rusted metal, the door slammed open. What Michael saw inside will haunt him forever. The room was small, barely larger than a closet. Chains dangled from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in deep gouges, scratch marks from fingernails. In the center stood something. It wasn't human. Not anymore. A twisted, gaunt figure crouched in the darkness, its limbs far too long, its skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its eyes were milky white, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Then it smiled. The voice he'd heard before didn't match its lips. The whispers were still coming, from the walls themselves. Michael stumbled back, realization hitting like a freight train. The thing hadn't been calling for help, it had been baiting him. The creature lunged with inhuman speed, knocking the flashlight from his hand. In the pitch black, Michael felt claws rake across his chest. He screamed, scrambling blindly for the door. He barely made it through, slamming the heavy metal barrier shut. The thing pounded from the other side, shrieking in a guttural, inhuman language. Michael didn't stop running. He fled through the basement, into the elevator, and up to the ground floor. He didn't even bother to grab his jacket, just sprinted out into the cold night, lungs burning. By the time Frank returned the next morning, Michael was gone. So was the chain on the service elevator. 3 days later, police found Michael's apartment empty. No sign of struggle. Just one thing out of place. Deep scratch marks etched into the bedroom walls. The report was quietly filed away. St. Agnes Memorial was demolished 2 months later. But if you stand at the site today, some nights, you might hear it. Scratch, 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 scratch. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a faint, trembling whisper. "Please, let me out." Story 2. The Night Shift at Hollow Creek High. Some places are built with good intentions. Schools are supposed to be safe havens, filled with laughter, learning, and youthful energy. But what happens when the walls of a school remember every whisper, every tear, every dark moment in its history? Hollow Creek High isn't like other schools. For over a century, it has stood on the outskirts of a small European town. its towering stone walls casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The locals speak of it in hushed voices, especially after sunset. This is the story of Ethan Myers, a janitor who took the night shift at Hollow Creek High, and discovered that some jobs come with a price far greater than a paycheck. Ethan wasn't looking for a fresh start. He was just looking for a way to keep the lights on. After his wife passed away and his daughter moved overseas, life had become a blur of empty days and long, sleepless nights. So when a friend told him the local boarding school was hiring a night custodian, he applied without hesitation. The headmistress, a stern woman named Ms. Whitlock, interviewed him in a dimly lit office. Her sharp eyes studied him like he was a test she didn't want to grade. "Your job will be simple," she said curtly. "Sweep the halls, empty the trash, lock the doors. But there are rules you must follow." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Rules?" Ms. Whitlock's face didn't soften. 1. Never enter classroom 6 after midnight. 2. If you hear voices, do not respond. And 3. She hesitated, then leaned closer. "If the hallways don't look the way you remember them, keep walking until they do." Ethan chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of local superstition. "You're serious?" "Deadly serious," she said flatly. "You may quit any time, Mr. Myers, but if you stay, you follow these rules." Something in her tone sent a chill down his spine, but he needed the money. So he nodded and signed the contract. His first night was uneventful. The students were already asleep in the dormitories, and the sprawling hallways were eerily silent. The building itself was breathtaking. Victorian architecture, towering windows, and grand staircases that creaked under his weight. But there was something oppressive about the silence, as if the building were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. By 1 a.m., Ethan was sweeping near the science wing when he heard it. A faint whispering, like two people talking behind a closed door. He froze, remembering rule number 2. If you hear voices, do not respond. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty hall. It didn't sound like students. The voices were low, raspy, almost ancient. Ethan's throat went dry. He gripped his broom tightly and forced himself to keep walking, eyes straight ahead. When he glanced over his shoulder, the hallway behind him was pitch black, as if the lights had been swallowed whole. The second night was worse. Around 2:13 a.m., Ethan noticed something strange. The hallways didn't seem right. He'd walked the same route the night before, but now the doors were in different places. The portraits on the walls, faded images of long-dead headmasters, seemed to watch him, their eyes following his every move. Rule number 3, if the hallways don't look the way you remember them, keep walking until they do. He did exactly that, heart pounding. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the familiar layout returned, and he collapsed onto a bench, shaking. On his third night, curiosity got the better of him. He wanted answers. Why was classroom 6 off limits? Why the strange rules? Why did the town treat the school like a burial ground? So, at exactly 11:59 p.m., he stood outside classroom 6, key in hand. The old wooden door loomed before him, its brass number plate tarnished with age. His pulse thundered in his ears as the clock ticked past midnight. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was frozen in time. Desks sat in perfect rows, untouched for decades. The blackboard was covered in chalk markings, strange symbols that didn't look like any language he knew. A layer of dust coated everything, except for one desk in the back, which looked freshly used. Ethan stepped closer, breath fogging in the cold air. As he reached for the desk, a child's giggle echoed behind him. He spun around. The room was full of children, dozens of them sitting silently at their desks, their faces pale and blurred like smeared paint. Their mouths opened in unison, releasing a deafening, inhuman wail. Ethan stumbled backward, slamming into the blackboard. The symbols began to glow, and the floor beneath him shifted, as if the room itself were alive. Suddenly, everything went dark. When he woke, he was lying in the main hallway. The clock on the wall read 2:13 a.m. Confused and terrified, he ran to the nearest exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he pushed, they remained locked. He sprinted through the hallways, but they kept changing, twisting into impossible angles. Sometimes he'd turn a corner and find himself right back where he started. He realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't trapped in the school. The school was trapped in him. From that night on, every shift was the same. At 2:13 a.m., the hallways would warp, the portraits would whisper, and no matter how far he ran, he always ended up back at classroom 6. He tried quitting, but every attempt failed. Whenever he packed his things and left, he'd wake up the next night inside the school, mop in hand, as if nothing had happened. One evening, desperate for answers, he confronted Ms. Whitlock. "What's happening to me?" he begged. "Why can't I leave?" Her expression was unreadable. "Because you don't belong anywhere else," she said softly. "Hollow Creek High has claimed you, Mr. Myers. You're part of its history now, just like the others." "The others?" She smiled, a cold, sad smile. "Why do you think we keep hiring night janitors?" The next night, Ethan returned to his duties, his mind fractured by terror and despair. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the familiar whispering began. This time, he didn't run. As the hallways twisted and the children's laughter echoed, Ethan understood his fate. He wasn't cleaning the school. He was maintaining it, like a caretaker for a nightmare that could never end. To this day, Hollow Creek High remains open. Students come and go, never suspecting the horrors that lurk beneath the surface. And if you ever visit late at night, you might catch a glimpse of a weary janitor sweeping the halls. He won't look up. He won't speak. Because if he does, the walls will remember your name too. Story 3. The Elevator That Shouldn't Move. Some dangers hide in the shadows. Others ride quietly between floors. Late-night office buildings are eerie places. Rows of cubicles sit in perfect silence. Coffee mugs abandoned mid-sip. Computers humming faintly like they're whispering secrets. But the elevators are alive in a different way. You push a button, and somewhere deep inside the walls, something mechanical stirs awake. For most of us, it's just routine. But for one janitor working the graveyard shift, an elevator became the gateway to something that should never have been opened. This is the story of David Holloway, and the elevator that didn't just take him between floors, it took him somewhere far worse. David had been working as a night janitor for over 20 years. He'd cleaned high schools, hospitals, malls, you name it. But his latest job was different. The Anderson Tower, a 40-story corporate skyscraper in the heart of New York City, wasn't just another office building. It was prestigious, the kind of place that screamed money and power. David didn't mind. The pay was good and he liked the solitude. The building was nearly empty after 10 p.m., with only a handful of late-night workers left behind. By midnight, it was just him, the security guard, and the endless hum of fluorescent lights. On his first night, the security guard, Tom, gave him the usual rundown. "Nothing to it, really," Tom said, sipping stale coffee. "Just clean the top 3 floors, empty the trash, and leave the rest for the day crew. Oh, and one thing." Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't use elevator number 3 after 3 a.m. David frowned. "Why? Is it broken?" Tom hesitated, glancing over his shoulder like someone might be listening. "Let's just say it's unreliable. If you need to go between floors, take number 1 or number 2. Trust me." David raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Superstitious nonsense, probably. Every building had its quirks. For the first few nights, everything was fine. David swept, vacuumed, emptied bins, and occasionally nodded to Tom on his rounds. But on the 4th night, around 2:55 a.m., something strange happened. David was on the 37th floor when he heard the ding of an elevator arriving. Curious, he peeked around the corner. Elevator Thurber 3's doors slid open. No one was inside. David checked the security cameras mounted nearby. The feed showed nothing. No one had pressed the call button. No one had entered or exited. The elevator just moved on its own. A chill crawled down David's spine. He remembered Tom's warning. Don't use elevator number 3 after 3 a.m. The next night, it happened again. At exactly 3:33 a.m., elevator number 3 descended to the lobby, paused, then rose back up, slowly, like it was hunting. David tried to ignore it, but his curiosity gnawed at him. Why would an empty elevator move like that, and why the oddly specific time? By the 5th night, he couldn't resist. He decided to watch. He crouched near the lobby, hidden behind a column, as the clock ticked past 3:30 a.m. At precisely 3:33, the elevator dinged and opened its doors. Inside was darkness, not just a lack of light, complete, suffocating blackness, like looking into a void. David's heart pounded. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath came out in visible puffs. Then, something moved inside. A pale, human-like hand reached toward the threshold, fingers long and twitching. But before it crossed the line, the doors slammed shut and the elevator shot upward. David stumbled back, gasping. He didn't tell Tom. He didn't know how to explain what he'd seen. The next night, David avoided the 3 a.m. window entirely, staying on the 30th floor and blasting music in his earbuds to drown out the noise. But just as he was finishing up, his radio crackled to life. "David? You there?" It was Tom, sounding unusually tense. "Yeah, what's up?" "We've got a problem. Cameras show movement. On floor B2, the sub-basement. No one's supposed to be down there." David frowned. "You want me to check it out?" "No," Tom said quickly. "Stay put. I'll handle it." The radio went silent. David waited, uneasy. Minutes passed. Then, nothing. No sign of Tom, no update. Finally, David's worry outweighed his fear. He headed for the service elevator. When he arrived, only elevator number 3 was waiting. The other elevators were parked on higher floors, completely unresponsive. The call buttons didn't work. It was like the building was forcing his hand. David's pulse thundered. He remembered Tom's warning. Don't use elevator number 3 after 3 a.m. But it was 3:40 now, and Tom could be in trouble. Taking a deep breath, David stepped inside. The air was freezing, his breath fogging immediately. The control panel looked wrong. Instead of the usual buttons, there was only one. A faded, scratched symbol he didn't recognize. He pressed it. The elevator lurched violently, plunging downward. The numbers on the display didn't make sense. 1, 2, 3. The descent didn't stop. It just kept going. Finally, with a gut-wrenching jolt, the doors opened. David stepped out into a long, dimly lit corridor lined with old filing cabinets and rusted equipment. The walls were damp, covered in strange black growths that pulsed faintly, like veins. In the distance, he heard whimpering. "Tom?" he called, his voice echoing. The whimpering stopped. Silence. Then a voice answered, but it wasn't Tom's. "David," it whispered. "We've been waiting for you." David's blood ran cold. The voice came from everywhere, reverberating through the walls. He turned to run back to the elevator, but it was gone. In its place was a solid wall, seamless and cold. The corridor began to change. The filing cabinets shifted, twisting into grotesque shapes. The black growths on the walls writhed like living things. David stumbled backward, hyperventilating. His flashlight beam landed on something horrifying, a pile of security uniforms, torn and blood-stained. On top lay Tom's keycard, cracked in half. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, until it became a deafening chorus. From the shadows, figures emerged. Tall, faceless things with elongated limbs and movements that were too smooth, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. They surrounded David, their heads tilting in unnatural synchrony. "You shouldn't have come here," the voices hissed in unison. "Now you belong to the tower." Before David could scream, they lunged. When the day crew arrived at 6 a.m., elevator number 3 was back in its usual spot. The doors opened to reveal nothing, just an empty, spotless interior. David was never seen again. A week later, the building hired a new night janitor. During his orientation, Tom, pale and hollow-eyed, gave the same speech he'd once given David. Clean the top 3 floors, empty the trash, and don't use elevator number 3 after 3 a.m. To this day, workers at Anderson Tower whisper about strange noises in the dead of night. Sometimes the security cameras catch blurry figures moving between floors, even when the building is empty. And every so often, at exactly 3:33 a.m., elevator number 3 descends to the sub-basement on its own. Its doors open to reveal nothing but darkness. But if you look closely, too closely, you might see a hand, pale and twitching, reaching for the edge. 3 janitors, 3 night shifts, 3 stories that remind us that sometimes the simplest jobs hide the darkest secrets. So the next time you're in a quiet building late at night, remember, don't open sealed doors, don't listen when the walls whisper your name, and never, ever, take the elevator that moves on its own, because once you see what's at the bottom, you'll never come back up.